A little bit nervous?
I am a little touch, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's kind of like doing a training session you've never done before. There's a bit of anticipation.
It's that apprehension of the watt bike session that
we've all been there, haven't we?
Yeah.
But the one thing we wanted to do with this, first of all, before we start talking nonsense, but there is some cool stuff, don't worry, is to our triathlete audience across the world is, first of all, say like what this podcast's about, not for just a laugh, but like how is it going to give you value? So if you're listening to this, I don't know, where could people be listening to this?
Panama,
Australia, on a train, in their sofa,
Australia on the beach, maybe,
anywhere. Why you're going to give up your 45 minutes of valuable time to listen to this? Because essentially that's what it's all about. What value are you going to get? So look, what we're going to do this, there are loads of great triathlon podcasts out there, and we wanted to make sure that we were giving value in a way that others don't. And those great triathlon podcasts are really good at giving advice across the board, sometimes on the science of triathlon training, sometimes like the community and things like that. What we wanted to do though was really hone in a little bit more on like the physical preparation, the stuff that we do as strength and conditioning coaches with triathletes and endurance athletes to make them better, to make them quicker, faster, more bulletproof against injuries. Because, as we know, we're the actually only online service that does strength and conditioning for triathletes.
One and only.
Across the whole world. And this podcast will actually be the only strength and conditioning podcast in the whole world for triathletes. But this isn't about strength and conditioning on the base of it. This is about making triathletes better using a tool that they don't really understand very well. Exactly. And even if you do know about it, we can help you a lot more with it. So do you think that kind of makes...
Yeah, I do. I think that's a good summary. I'm interested though, where did the name come from?
Yes. So my first thought was that I don't just want to call it the Tenacious podcast, because that sounds like really obvious. Yeah. But then I thought actually one of the most successful podcasts in the world is the Joe Rogan podcast, which is just his name. So clearly
it works.
It works. So again, my experience of podcasting went straight out the window. But one of the big things with the podcast as well was personality.
Yeah.
One thing that we like to think we do relatively well is talk on social media, on emails, and on this, as we do when we coach people on the gym floor. Indeed. And sometimes with podcasts, it's very easy for everything to become a bit grey, a bit like a corduroy suit.
It's a bit robotic, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's just a bit boring, and it doesn't really get across the message in a way that can inspire, entertain, and really help inform people at a game. So we really wanted to make sure that they had that side of it. So that's kind of where the foolish element came in. We don't take ourselves too seriously, but we are coaches. We do this professionally as a full-time trade and have been for well over a decade. So we wanted to really get that across, and I think that's something that, again, is a little bit different.
Yeah, I do totally agree. Yeah.
But whether anyone else will like us,
I'm sure they will, Dave. There's no reason why they wouldn't.
Yeah, we'll wait and see. Tenacious bit was really, like we tried Tenacious, I think any triathlete is tenacious. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner, a novice, experienced to professional, you have to have that tenacious mentality.
That's a characteristic, don't you?
Yeah, we see it with people you coach. Like, it doesn't matter about age, gender. So that was the first quality. But again, with the foolish bit, like, most people who don't do triathlon think triathletes like us are just stupid.
They do indeed.
I don't know, have you ever had any, from friends or family, any kind of comments of why would you do that?
Yeah, I've been on many a bike ride and arrived at my destination. If I've cycled over to parents' house and they've gone, you're bonkers.
Exactly. But I think all of us like the fact that people think that a bit.
Yeah, definitely.
So again, the fools and the foolish side of it was again linked to that kind of light-hearted fact that, do you know what, we do like being recognised as being a bit mad and a bit foolish. I suppose what makes us feel a bit cut above. So that's where the phrase Tenacious Fools came from. Whether people see us as the fools, I don't know. Hopefully we're a bit more than that, but we'll wait and see. So, cracking on from that, we wanted to touch upon the format of these are going to be, first of all, we're going to do them a little bit shorter, around about 45 minutes. The reason being, I think for a lot of podcasts and a lot of time availability for people, they don't have loads of time just to listen to stuff.
Yeah.
And that includes us, wouldn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, we spoke about it briefly beforehand. The best podcasts are generally the ones around that time frame. Any longer, and I think you find yourself switching off.
Yeah, well, you can't really listen to the whole thing.
No.
But it's not just going to be me and Craig speaking. What we've done is highlighted a guest list, which, again, I think sometimes on podcasts you can have the same people recycled a bit, which isn't necessarily a problem if they're talking about fresh things. But we really felt with some of the topics we're covering, whether it's to do with swim, bike, run, whether it's to do with strength, power, speed, injury prevention, mental fatigue, all these things that are critical for you as a triathlete that really isn't explored very much. With some of the guests that we've got, I mean, they're world class.
They're like celebrities in the world of performance and strength conditioning.
We've basically now said our guest list of celebrities. So,
well, to me, they are.
They are, though. That is true. They are amongst the very best at what they do. And because a lot of the time we've already spoke to these people, we can ask questions which give you answers and insight a lot more better than if we don't really understand the topic or if we don't know that person. But because we do know the topic really well, and we do know the person, it gives us a much more bigger platform to give you a lot more quality. So our first kind of topic was going to be, and will be, and we'll reveal the guest shortly, on running, performance and strength training.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I genuinely think if you were to say to most triathletes, strength training, there is a general consensus that strength training will make them big, make them bulky, which is a massive misconception. However, it is one that exists, and generally it's breaking down that wrong perception and giving triathletes confidence in the sense that strength training done in the right way will improve their performance.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. But I think equally it's understandable why triathletes would feel that maybe strength training could have some of those negative effects because of maybe, I don't know, old fads that are in magazines. And sometimes you just think, well, weights makes you big. So we understand why people think that way. But like you said, if you look at the evidence, it's just not that way.
And it goes back to the old point that if you're clear on something and you have clarity on it, you'll generally trust the product more. And I think that's that's what we're here to help with as well.
Totally. And again, we were talking just before this, and actually on the interview shortly, I'm sure we cover it. If you can understand an area simply, but you can understand it. Yeah. So, for example, with strength training as a triathlete, all of a sudden you're going to be, as you said, invested in that process more because you can connect the dots between saying, okay, doing these exercises will improve my running because it does this. I get that, and I'm going to do it. Whereas with anything in life, if you don't really understand it, you're never going to really trust it. And if you don't trust it, well, you're not really going to bother doing it. And maybe that's one of the reasons why strength training has not been embraced as much by runners and triathletes. I
completely agree with that, yeah. And, as long as you do the time constraints that we've said, that, you're doing 3 disciplines and we want this to be a 4th discipline, and so it should be, I think barriers are very quick to come up when you don't fully understand things. So
what we'll do is we'll get really into the interview now. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to the guest, just on the clip that you're about to hear. But again, this is a world-class person who we're interviewing and gives you total trust and belief on how strength training can positively help you with your running as a triathlete. So, nevertheless, enjoy, and we'll speak to you shortly. So I'm inviting on today a guy who I consider, and I'm not just saying this to blow smoke up his arse, but essentially probably the best person you could go to understand the science behind strength training for the endurance sport of running. This guy has published so much great stuff, but also he's just a good guy as well, hence why I've had him on. And really, for me, there's no better person to be able to go to. So I'm invited on and would like to welcome Mr. Richard Blagrove. How are you doing, Rich?
Yeah, really good. Thanks, Dave. And thanks for the very generous introduction there.
All totally honest. And we were slightly late starting today, which was my fault. So if anything, I should be thanking you for rescheduling the call. But we'll get straight into it, Rich. We met, I think, probably 3 years ago when you were at City University, was it, in Birmingham?
Yes, it was, yeah.
And had a great chat there. You invited me along. It was a really cool afternoon. But essentially, just for those who don't know who you are, a little bit of introduction as to who you are, what you do, and essentially why people should bother to listen to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a lecturer in physiology and the program leader for the Masters in Strength and Conditioning at Loughborough University. I've been there for about 2 years now. And as you just mentioned, prior to that, I was a senior lecturer in sport and exercise science at Birmingham City University. And then before that, I spent almost 9 years working at St Mary's as senior lecturer in strength and conditioning and running an undergraduate program there. So yeah, I've been working in HE now for best part of 13 years. But alongside these academic roles that I've had, I've always very much been a strength and conditioning coach and a practitioner. And I guess similar to most S&C coaches around, I worked with quite a few different sports and athletes in the early days, like everything from football to basketball to ice hockey and equestrian. But then I sort of, I guess, unintentionally specialized a little bit in work with middle and long distance runners, primarily because that was my background as an athlete. And I guess it's my main passion. So it's my main interest from a sports perspective. But I've also pursued quite a lot of research in that area over the last few years as well. So my PhD was looking at the effects of strength training in adolescent middle distance runners specifically. And my current research is sort of building on that a little bit, just to try and investigate the role of strength training in improving performance and trying to lower the risk of injury in endurance runners.
Cool. Well, yeah, hell of a resume, and obviously now up at Loughborough, which isn't a million miles away. But funny enough, actually, I was going to say you're still living in Bromsgrove, which ironically, I've had to do this podcast recording at my parents' house due to internet problems. Which, funny enough, is probably about 2 miles away from where you are up in Marlbrook. So we're probably literally. Yeah, it's a stone's throw. And actually, I'm going to go running later, and I'll probably might go past wherever you're living. So, yeah, if you
I
see
should have
what
just popped in.
well, mate, if you see someone gasping for air and struggling, you know it'll be me. But no, absolute pleasure to have you on board. And again, the questions that we're going to be going through, no better person to get some proper evidence, but also be able to mix that in with the practicality of kind of how to do that with training as a triathlete. So I guess a simple question in many ways, but sometimes can be challenges, kind of in layman's terms for all our triathlete listeners across the world. In what ways would you say strength training can specifically improve endurance running performance?
So yeah, I guess as most of your listeners will be aware, so all of the triathlon disciplines, so running, cycling, and swimming, are all predominantly limited by sort of our physiology. So that's like how fast our heart can beat, how much oxygen and blood can get towards the working muscles, and then how effectively the working muscles can use oxygen in order to create energy. So it's mainly limited by the highest amount of that we can do. In other words, the highest amount of oxygen that we can transport to the working muscles and then use effectively. So scientifically, that's kind of referred to as maximal oxygen uptake. But there's a second kind of construct or attribute that's important, that's more to do with then how high we can get, or how close we can get to this kind of ceiling of oxygen use during some sort of extensive type effort, like we see in triathlon. But then a third area which interests us as strength and conditioning coaches is something known as exercise economy, or running economy for runners. And that's how much energy that we can use at a submaximal intensity or running speed. And the reason that that's quite interesting to us is we know that economy is influenced by the way in which a kind of muscle behaves during its contraction. And so that's related to how much force that it can express and how we can control the forces when we're producing any sort of movement. And we know that strength training can influence that quite nicely. So we can change the amount of force that a muscle can produce, and also control the way in which muscles manage and control forces. So as part of my PhD, actually, we did a quick kind of review of the literature to find out how many studies have looked at the effects of strength training on exercise economy, and specifically running economy, and then whether it had actually shown any sort of positive benefit. And what we tend to see from the scientific literature is that if we go through a period of about 2 or 3 months of strength training, we see improvements in running economy of about 2 to 8% compared to a training regime where we're only running. And this seems to help improve our performance, and therefore we get quicker times in time trials and races and so on.
And again, even though sometimes research doesn't necessarily answer all the questions, one big thing is obviously with triathlon, we've got short sprint distances, and then we've got events right up to Ironman length distances. Kind of, even if not using any evidence, because there might not necessarily be any, from your own intuition, how do you think those improvements in running economy from strength training could be additive for those shorter events as well as longer events? Would you say it's similar? Would you say it could be more pronounced in one versus the other? What would you say?
Yeah, it differs a little bit according to which distance we're trying to specialize in. I mean, again, what we do seem to know is that running economy or exercise economy seems to relate very closely to both middle distance type performance and longer distance performance, but it seems to be more important for the longer duration events. So in particular, marathon runners rely very, very heavily on running economy and essentially trying to use the lowest amount of energy possible to perform at a submaximal intensity. So I guess sort of colloquially, we refer to that as just being efficient with the way in which we're moving. And so I guess it seems like a bit of a kind of paradox and a bit of a contradiction, but if we get stronger, it improves the way in which we perform over much, much longer distances, like marathon type intensities, even though it does seem to still benefit things like middle distance performance as well.
I don't know, again, from your own experience of coaching those in the likes of endurance sports, as you've said, that almost seems the opposite to what people would expect
Yeah.
based on just looking at the training on the face of it, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's yeah, and I guess it's you've got sort of two polar opposites of the specificity continuum. You've got lifting very heavy weights and jumping on big boxes and bounding across the surface as far as we can go in like 6 steps, for example, at one end. And then you've got running for 2, 3, 4 hours at the other end of the scale. And yeah, trying to get your head around why one would benefit the other is sometimes quite tricky, I think, particularly for runners that haven't ever done any strength training before.
I love it. And I think it's such a strong opening point because, as you've just mentioned, unless you can understand the science, you're not going to appreciate from just looking at things on the face of it, actually, if something can improve something. So most endurance people look at weights, they think, well, that's something you do that's very heavy, very intense for not very long. So it's not really going to help me. But as you said, when you actually look at the science, the actual evidence is the complete opposite as well. So perfect. And if you were to say then, everybody's always interested in, okay, well, that's cool, but what is it fundamentally which enables that to happen? What is strength training doing? What's it adapting? What's it changing in the body to make us more economical with our running? Again, to our average triathlon listener, what would you say would be a good answer for that?
Yeah, I'll try to, I guess, break down the mechanisms and elaborate on a couple of things that I alluded to just before. So, what we know about economy or efficiency of movement is essentially how much energy that we're using to perform a submaximal intensity of effort. So, if you think about running, every time our foot hits the ground, we sort of flex at the ankle, knee, and hip, so they all bend simultaneously. And what comes with that bending is obviously a lengthening of the muscle and the tendon. And then when we bounce back off the ground and our foot, we reach the kind of toe off position as part of running gait, all the muscles contract to essentially propel us back into the next stride. And so essentially that lengthening and shortening of the muscle obviously uses energy. And so if we want to use less energy and be a bit more efficient, we need the muscle to lengthen a little bit less and kind of shorten, I guess, a little bit more efficiently. And that's what we seem to get through strength training. So when our foot hits the ground, it doesn't lengthen quite as much. So therefore it doesn't need to shorten quite as much. So it essentially remains a little bit closer towards a sort of static state. And if a muscle's fairly static, i.e. it's not really changing its length and having to shorten very much, it essentially ends up using less energy. So we save energy for later on in things like marathon performance or triathlons, and we become more economical and efficient with the way in which we're moving.
Cool. And I kind of segueing in quite nicely to the other aspect, which, again, for most endurance athletes, when they think of strength and conditioning, can sometimes be more of an important factor sometimes. And that's obviously resisting injury. So, put in simple terms, spending less time on the physio bench. again, even though maybe not a very highly explored area from a research perspective, nevertheless, what would you say evidence suggests regarding the use of strength training in potentially minimizing injury risk and obviously reducing the number of days training, doing swim, bike, and run?
Yeah, it is a super interesting area, this one, and I think it's probably the area that runners and just endurance athletes in general are more interested in, more so than the performance improvement, surprisingly. And we kind of know this again through some research. So, like, one of the studies that I did as part of my PhD was just a simple survey, and we asked 2,000 runners whether they did any strength and conditioning or not. And of the ones that did do strength and conditioning, the most common reason why they did it was to try and offset the risk of injury rather than trying to improve performance. So you'd kind of expect that there was quite a lot of good science and evidence to show that incorporating strength and conditioning as part of your training week lowers the risk of getting injured. But it actually, surprisingly, that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, it's theoretically quite sound because, I mean, what we know about loading a tissue heavily. So if I do some resistance training and put a lot of sort of a big mechanical stimulus through it, or I do some jumping exercises, which really loads the tendons and bones and so on, we know we get improvements in things like bone strength and bone mineral density. We get improvements in tendon density and thickness, improvements in the health of ligaments and the strength of muscles. So all of those sorts of adaptations theoretically kind of allow those tissues to cope with higher volumes and intensities of effort and loading. So therefore they shouldn't kind of break down quite as readily, and we sort of raise the threshold before those tissues get to failure. And we've also got some good information around particularly hip strength, so specifically the strength of the gluteal muscles seems to be quite closely related to some types of overuse injury in runners. So generally, runners who have lower hip strength seem to pick up things like gluteal tendinopathies, IT band syndrome, patellofemoral, so knee pain, and Achilles tendinopathies, more so than those runners that have got higher levels of hip strength. So again, it kind of makes logical sense to make muscles stronger because it lowers the risk of getting these injuries. But when we actually look at kind of the experimental evidence, so the studies that have taken groups of runners, put them on some sort of strength and conditioning program, and then compared it to a group that just carry on their normal running, there doesn't seem to be very much difference in the rates of injuries and the types of injuries that the participants are getting. Like, those studies aren't great, like they're quite short, like generally the programs are not supervised. And certainly I guess for me and you, Dave, like they're not really proper strength training programs. It's maybe like some home-based stuff with some resistance bands and things. So I think the design of the studies could be better, but yeah, like actually the direct evidence isn't compelling when it comes to strength training lowering the risk of injury.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area because, as you've said, the science behind a lot of strength and conditioning endurance sports is highly limited, and a lot of what we rely on therefore is based on good theoretical evidence from other areas. So you mentioned some good ones to do with bones and tendons. We've got good ones on getting stronger at longer muscle lengths and reducing muscular base strains and bits and pieces. But I definitely think what you said there is one of the key limiting factors. And this isn't something I really appreciated, I don't think, until I left rugby union, which was where I'd spent the first 7 years of my career, was when you work, and I always think I can not critique, but because I do endurance sports, I feel I'm in a position where if I do generalize a bit, I'm generalizing myself, so I'm not being horrible. But there is a big tendency where technically the execution of strength training is massively limited, and therefore you don't expect to see the benefits that you would, not because necessarily sometimes the exercise could be a good exercise, but the actual execution of the exercise just is nowhere near correct. So the muscles aren't getting loaded. Have you observed anything similar in terms of your own experiences?
Yeah, I think, yeah, certainly with distance runners, because like obviously with distance runners, like their programs are very volume driven. Like they're used to getting hot and sweaty and getting their heart rates up and feeling quite a lot of muscle burn. And so when they do other types of training that are non-running based, that's kind of what they sort of expect to feel and see. And that's not really what a lot of strength training is about, particularly when we're trying to target the nervous system. And so it's a much more, I guess, intangible type of fatigue, and we don't really get those sorts of physiological sensations. And so it's about, educating the athlete about the role of strength training, trying to teach appropriate technique, like you were alluding to, and then just making sure that they're following the appropriate set and rep regimes to try and optimize the benefits that they're getting from it.
Yeah, no, and actually that will lead on nicely for in a little bit for us to tap into some of the common errors or mistakes that we sometimes see. Again, not to point fingers, but to actually help people. So
Yeah.
again, linking into that aspect of research and how, like with strength and conditioning, if you only based what you did just on research, you'd be very limited in what you delivered.
Yeah.
What areas potentially linking strength training to improving endurance in running, for example, could there potentially be that necessarily hasn't really been explored or hasn't really been studied extensively? There might be none. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's tons of stuff here because, sort of, I guess what you're getting at is like what kind of avenues could research explore which it hasn't already, but maybe that coaches perhaps already know about,
Yeah.
or can kind of see in their runners when they're training and racing and so on. I mean, one study we've actually just started, which hasn't been done at all, is trying to look at how economy and efficiency of movement changes over the course of a much longer run, and whether that's related to how strong runners are. Because what we often, and I'm sure you've heard this with a lot of triathletes and runners you've worked with, Dave, but one of the sensations that runners seem to get after they've been through a period of strength training, having not done it before, is that they kind of say, "Oh, I just feel stronger," particularly when I do my longer runs. Like I kind of get this second wind. And yeah, scientifically, you're kind of like, well, is that just their running fitness that's improved, or have they actually got some benefit from strength training? Like, is it something about the technique that's changed? So they're just sort of running with better posture or better technique, particularly during the later stages of a long run. So we're trying to unpick that a little bit with the study we've just started. So in other words, does strength training status or how strong a runner is offset the decrease that we see in economy over the course of a very prolonged run? So we're getting runners to run for 90 minutes, and we're trying to look at the link between the change in economy over that 90-minute run and then essentially how strong they are, which is a reflection of how much strength training they've done over the years. I think a second area, which I guess is more interesting for the kind of cross country, fell and ultra distance running community, is whether engaging with strength training long term reduces the amount of muscle damage that they get in the event. Because we know that muscle damage is one of the main reasons or mechanisms why we see the performance decrease during like very, very prolonged efforts. So when we get runners going for hours and hours, like 3, 4, 5, 6 hours during an ultra marathon, let's say, they're obviously getting quite a high level of muscle damage. But if the runner's very well conditioned, in terms of the amount of eccentric, like heavy resistance training they've done, probably plyometric training as well, like does it offset how much muscle damage they get? So therefore, again, like does it improve their performance during the later stages of those massive efforts? I don't think we really know very much about that at all at the moment.
That's really interesting because I mean, I think most people think with strength and conditioning it'd be the more sprint and Olympic distances
Yeah,
that gravitate towards S&C. But our experience is actually we work with as many, if not slightly more, middle to long distance
yeah,
um, triathletes. So half marathon, half Ironman, full Ironman. Where obviously what you've just said there with muscle damage is is highly significant. But actually, that's an area that I haven't even necessarily directly thought about, but is really interesting. And actually, just scouring Google Scholar as I sometimes do, rather sadly, just looking at some more recent research. And again, you mentioned kind of eccentric strength, just in that. And they were looking at various things in terms of certain elements to do with running technique and performance. And the one thing they did distinguish was the impact of eccentric leg strength on running performance. I can't remember what distance it was over. Again, with that eccentric strength, so for those who don't know, basically your strength as muscles lengthen. What key areas do you think that links into? How valuable do you think that eccentric strength is to runners, triathletes?
Yeah, it predominantly, I mentioned it as part of the last response that I just gave, but it's predominantly linked into plyometric training as in terms of a training modality. There's a few different ways that we can eccentrically load through resistance training as well. So just put loads of load on an exercise. So for example, if we're using a leg press, you essentially just whack up the weight really, really high, get to the top range of position with 2 legs usually, and then lower down very, very slowly just with 1 leg. So it's essentially more weight than 1 leg can handle, but you're just going through that eccentric or muscle lengthening phase of the exercise. But yeah, going back to what I mentioned first, so plyometric training would be the main way in which we train that eccentric component. I mentioned plyometrics a couple of times. So essentially what we're trying to do here is take quite similar movements to the running gait, but essentially increase the amount of force that the leg's got to deal with when it lands. And so if we essentially jump very high in the air, we've got to cope with more force when we land compared to like a normal running gait technique. And equally, if we do some hopping or do some bounding where we're trying to cover quite a lot of distance with each step, again, the leg is having to deal with much higher forces than what it's used to as part of running technique. And so, yeah, when the foot lands, we've obviously go through this rapid eccentric muscle tendon lengthening. And it's essentially trying to teach the muscle to switch on very, very quickly and deal with that very, very high force in a rapid way. And so the adaptations that we get at muscle and tendon level enable us to cope with that higher level of force. And that seems to help promote running economy, as we said before.
Well, what was in essence, well, at least we think anyway, you're not going to come across a better example of explaining, again, in layman's terms, not being crazy complex,
No.
how strength training will make you better factually with your running as a triathlete.
Agreed. Yeah.
Agreed. I mean, like, stunning.
Yeah.
Really good. And again, what's really interesting, I think, when we look at this is like, just to give some context, like running economy isn't just like, because it's not taught so much. When people are studied, like your world-class athletes, I know I'm not one of them either, nor Greg.
Me neither.
To improve performance, that is almost one of the most valuable, most sought after things that coaches, triathletes are trying to improve, isn't it?
It is indeed.
But because it's not taught a lot that much, I can see how it'd be very easy for people to think, 5% improvement in running economy. It sounds nice, but like, it's not really going to make a difference. Like, we actually find the more well-trained you are, anyone who's heard of VO2 max, it's basically the amount of oxygen that you can use with your body every minute. The higher that is, obviously, typically the better your endurance. But there comes a point where that becomes less and less influential. Yes. But the one thing that becomes more and more influential, that's your running economy. So really do not underestimate 5%, roughly speaking, improvement over...
Across the board is huge.
Yeah, I mean, 8-week period, roughly speaking. I mean, that is...
You take that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So we kind of wanted to throw that one out there. I don't know, thoughts from yourself just in terms of, again, from our experience of doing this day in, day out over years, working with people like the listeners here, you beautiful people. What are your kind of like take homes and key messages from that?
Well, first of all, you'd be mad not to. Secondly, there's so many benefits there. Obviously, improve running economy. So essentially holding the same speed for a less given amount of energy. Secondly, triathlon's primarily a distance-based sport, as in you tend to follow the trend where you do a sprint triathlon, maybe Olympic, onto a half Ironman, etc. Ultimately being better, strength trained, stronger, allows you to sort of do that in essence without any additional time, because strength training isn't one of those things where you just keep adding time on or distance on like your other volumes. You could do a 45-minute session and that would stay as a 45-minute session and still get stronger within that time frame, week by week, progressively. That has major effect on the fact that actually you'll just be so much more resistant to fatigue across the course of the distance that you're trying to complete.
And that's why, again, like if we're looking at actually performance gains, if we're looking at that science that Rich speaks about, we know that when people have done strength training alongside their endurance training, we see them complete distances quicker, or they can run further within the same time period. And one of the cool things, I mean, every myself included, we all want that second kick towards the end.
Completely.
And again, some of the most latest research shows with running and strength trained runners end up having a better second kick compared to those who don't. But again, the one thing, again, it sounds really simple, but I think sometimes it's remembering as well that these studies are looking at everybody doing the same endurance training. The only difference is the strength work. So in other words, if people want these gains, you have to do the strength training. Whereas I think sometimes there's the belief, well, if I do an extra little run and stuff, I'll get the same. But it obviously depends on your training program and how much you're doing. But these results are, exclusive to strength training itself. And obviously adding in extra runs and stuff can be helpful. I'm not saying that that's the case.
No.
But we know these benefits only come as a byproduct of adding strength training on to what you're already doing. And as you said, there are loads of practical ways to do that don't add time into your training week, aren't there?
There are indeed. And, that's important given most triathletes' lifestyles, working full time typically, like me and Dave are. And then trying to...
Working?
Is
this work?
Is this work? Trying to add, 4 disciplines on top of that. We had a good example this morning, or at least... I had one coaching a lady, absolute warrior in terms of triathlon, but again, hasn't been able to fit the same amount of volume in that she would have done. She had 2 years ago, she did this particular event, but was still able to go and do the event based on probably 25% less volume because she is so much better strength trained than she was then. So again, proving the point that essentially her ability to cope with fatigue and still apply force on the run, the bike, and through the water is evidently still there. She could still go and do an Olympic distance.
Yeah, warrior, definitely. Well, if you can fall over during the latter stages of the full Ironman and look like you've kind of been hit and persevere through.
Pitch black, I think it was as well.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
Change of tone.
Yes.
Obviously, Rich made note of his kind of top tunes to listen to. Well, he kind of wiggled out of it a bit, I'd say. He gave me some genres. I'm sorry, Rich. He gave me some specific, but pretty much gave me a couple. I'm sure everybody would love to know, based on your fascinating musical taste, what would your top 5 training tunes be?
It has to be quite... I'd say, first and foremost, it's got to be top of the list. Eye of the Tiger. I think when that comes on and you're in the depths of a watt bike session.
Solid, yeah.
Top tune. I think then we're probably going to go down the world of rap, which is definitely not my area. But like Eminem.
Wow.
Till I Collapse is a good one. Bit of Bon Jovi in there as well. I think I've got to add it in because I'm well known for it. A bit of Meatloaf as well.
Yeah, you do like me.
I do, yeah. So yeah, how about yourself, Dave?
Well, I think I should save that for another episode.
Okay.
I think, yeah. I mean, I'm sure people will have enough time now to go on Spotify and select the ones that you've put on in there.
Yeah.
I'm not responsible for anything that Craig suggests.
All those PBs that start to happen.
All those negative performances from listening to Meatloaf. But yeah, nevertheless. So yes, I think there's a bit of a closing almost from what we said. I think what you said, you'd be mad not to, is just a great point, because we know it doesn't matter if you're a novice or if you're hugely well trained, the benefits are still exactly the same.
Exactly.
Time isn't a problem if you know how to do it and you're doing it smartly. But hopefully, as well as hopefully a small smile on the face from some of the nonsense that us two have came out with, the actual meat of how you can definitely improve your run performance as a result of strength training has been, or maybe become a little bit more clearer from not just hearing us, but again, a world-leading expert on the science of it. But one last thing before we go, I just wanted to touch on was just the injury side of stuff, because it's something that's really not being studied, very little. And just speaking to Rich afterwards and me and Craig speaking, anecdotally, by that's just me trying to use a clever word that we use in science, basically, in the real world, from our own experience, there is definitely a relationship between how strength or lack of strength creates injuries. So like Rich mentioned a bit about indirect stuff that we know. Tendon injuries will happen more if you haven't got strength in the muscles they connect to. We typically know as well, people who overstride are characteristic of being weak at the hips,
Yep.
significantly have great hip injuries, greater knee injuries, greater lower back injuries, all these types of things. So sometimes the science is very behind, isn't it, in terms of the realities of what we're doing in the real world.
It is indeed. And if there's one thing that really keeps you doing what you love doing, which is triathlon, I can guarantee you it is strength training. You have that, and it allows you to, add those years on and keep doing what you love doing in terms of your sport.
Yeah, no, definitely. And hey, it's not for everybody. And that isn't an advert for us to say you need to have your strength training done with us. Of course, you'd be mad not to know. Nevertheless, I won't dig that hole. But it's just, again, looking at evidence and sharing real world coaching experience like us. What we do see is whenever we see anybody with any type of injury as a triathlete, whether it's Achilles tendon problems,
shoulder issues,
meniscus problems at the knee.
Yeah.
When we do the assessments, there is always very, very vivid issues with certain movements which are specifically down to lack of strength in certain ways.
Agreed.
Without any doubt at all. And I think if you spoke to, I've spoken to extensive as Craig as strength and conditioning coaches in endurance sport at all levels, that is something that all of us know. Obviously, the way you go about it will determine how well you improve those things. But I think it's just a big motivating part. Everybody wants to start the physio couch. They don't want to be wrapped up in K-tape. You want to be out, swim, bike and run. And even though there are performance gains, I think if people know you can stay out on the road, out in the pool, whatever it is, a little bit longer and not have as many injuries, I think that's a big win, isn't it?
Oh, it's huge, yeah. I mean, it's huge. You got to keep doing what you love doing.
Exactly. And we will say no more apart from that. So, second episode is going to be part 2 of the interview with Rich, where we start to delve into practically how he and how that science can enable you to actually, practically train in the best way to improve those things. So what from that science, what do we know are the best ways for you to start to do strength training? As I've just said, the success of achieving those benefits is down to how you do those things. So again, what does his experience and what does the science tell us about how you can best do those things? So again, absolute gold in terms of what you can get from that. I had a thoroughly great time talking about it. And again, myself and Craig will be adding in some extra tips and insights, particularly on the practical level to help you on that front. And I'm sure we'll have a bit more random banter and nonsense to probably talk about.
That will definitely be happening, I'm sure.
I'm probably sure. Maybe I'll reveal my top training tunes. Maybe I'll put it on hold. There's a few other questions I asked Rich, which I won't reveal yet. I'm sure I'll throw my hat into the mix anyway. But nevertheless, we will leave it there. I want to say thank you for listening to this. I would love it. Actually, no, we would love it. We would love it if you could like, share, comment, whatever it is on any social media platform about what you thought about this. Now, that is a risky thing because you might say, I just listened to these two blokes speak absolute nonsense. Hey, if that's the case, that's the case. But we like to honestly think, because we're passionate about this, because we're highly experienced and skilled in it, and we understand people like you as triathletes, that you will have got some value from it. And hey, hopefully with a bit more practice, we'll get even better at this.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah, well, hopefully anyway. We've got loads of other great guests lined up as well, covering all sorts of topics as well. So please, comment, share, let us know what you thought, whatever it is, that would be absolutely superb. And for those of you, as always, who want to learn more about what we do to support triathletes across the world, not just at our training facility, but across 9 different countries, to enable them to run quicker, be more injury resistant, and everything else with triathlon. You can learn more about the online strength and conditioning support we provide at www.trytenacious.com. And that is the only advert you'll hear on this, because we've got no adverts, so you don't need to listen to all that nonsense at the start. But if, for example, I don't know, a major sponsor in the world of sport did want to get in contact, I'm sure we could come to some type of arrangement.
Not a subtle hint.
Not a subtle hint at all.
Not at all.
Yeah.
No.
But you've got my email address at the bottom of this. Nevertheless, we'll leave it at that. So it's goodbye from Craig.
And goodbye from Dave.
Hey, we didn't even have to practice that. Fantastic. Thanks for listening and cheers.